If I were to ask you, what is the greatest conflict in Star Wars history? You know, the constant issue that without fail engulfs the galaxy in flames and destruction time and time again, what would you say? Well, it's not the dark side versus the light side. It's not the Mandalorians versus everyone else. It's not even humans versus non-humans. It's something a bit more simple and more focused on culture and geographics. You see, 25,000 years ago, the modern version of the Star Wars galaxy as we know it began. It all starts with the fall of the legendary Rakan Empire, which enslaved much of the galaxy and then suddenly disappeared within a few generations due to a mysterious force plague. The Republic would form in the Rakan Empire's place, and it would be made up of the many freed slaves that the Rakan Empire employed all across the galaxy. They would base their capital on Coruscant, right in the deep core. In those early days, there were no hyperspace travel. The technology that the Rakans used for FTL speed was lost. And so in order to connect all of these former Rakan Empire worlds, the Republic had to rely on sleeper ships or generational ships that took hundreds and hundreds of years to cross what in the modern Star Wars galaxy took only maybe a few hours. Now, if you take a close look at the galactic map, you'll notice something interesting with how each region is named. First, you have the deep core, which is where Coruscant, Alderaan, Corellia are all located. This is the center of all economic activity in the galaxy, and it's also the political and cultural center of the Republic as well. Directly outside of that, you have the core, and then it goes straight to the colonies, which suggests that these are planets being settled by core-word explorers, which is usually what happens in the fringes of any nation that is undergoing a lot of expansion. But the issue is outside of the colonies area, you have the inner rim, which is kind of confusing, and then immediately followed by that, you have the expansion region, which again sounds like the periphery of a nation, but outside of that is the mid-rim, which honestly isn't in the middle of the galaxy because it's actually bordering the outer rim, which is the true peripheral of the galaxy. What this map shows us is the continued expansion of the Galactic Republic, which occurred over the course of tens of thousands of years. And this expansion carried out by the Galactic Republic really does mirror a lot of expansion we see here on Earth with human societies. As land prices and living expenses on Coruscant became higher and higher and the entire planet's surface was covered in steel and glass, people who were unable to find their way in the economic system found themselves being pushed below the surface into the undercities. And at the same time, those with the courage and credits to book a shuttle or freighter off-planet took their chances building homesteads, first in the colonies regions, then in the expansion region, and finally, in the last frontier, the Outer Rim. This is not all that different from the gradual expansion done in the Americas in the 18th and 19th century westward. The first wave of explorers in the Republic charted out new hyperspace lanes for everyone to follow. Many of these individuals were actually Force users and members of the Jedi Explorer Corps, who were specialized in reading the cosmos and finding gravitational anomalies with the Force. The people who followed them were entrepreneurs and also corporate entities who were looking for new resources to exploit, and of course a lack of regulations to keep costs down. You also had hustlers and dreamers who were born into a life or a station that did not really fit their expectations, and so they would go seek glory and riches in the Outer Rim. You had people trying to escape the law or corporate debt, people who were looking for freedom from urbanization, from materialism, from religious restrictions, like the first Dark Jedi, who were hunted down by the Jedi Order for their dark side curiosity and kicked out into the Outer Rim to Korriban. Even the Twang, who were the legendary progenitors of the Mandalorian people, were kicked out of the core regions and had to establish a planet known as Mandalore in the fringes of the galaxy. And so this expansion would continue and continue until there were essentially two very different classes of people in the galaxy, two very different groups. In the core, you had the privileged citizens of the Republic. They benefited greatly from the Galactic Republic's stable rule and free market. There were never any shortages in goods in the core, rarely ever any coups or political instability, and even less incursions by bandits and pirates. Life was good and people generally benefited from the Republic's rule, and so they were very supportive of the central government. And then out in the peripherals you had the fringe dwellers, who were more or less dependent on local government or in some cases just themselves in order to survive. On many of these worlds there was no infrastructure, not even a spaceport, no communications, no stable hyperspace lanes to get you to the planet. Life was difficult and people had to learn how to basically figure out how to build everything they needed for survival. They really could only depend on themselves or their close-knit communities. The Republic was seen as a foreign and far away entity. The only issue is the Galactic Republic claimed most of the territory in the galaxy, but their system of representation was flawed at best. Most core worlds received direct representation, that means one senator, one planet. But the further out you went, entire systems would be represented by one senator, or entire sectors, which was multiple systems, would be represented by one senator. For instance, Padme Amidala technically wasn't the senator from Naboo, as a lot of people mistaken her for. She was actually the senator for the entire Trammel sector, which included 36 member worlds, 40,000 settled dependencies, and over 300 million barren stars. To think that one person from Naboo could somehow represent all of those constituents in the Trammel sector in the same way that a planetary senator from Quads could represent his own people is just a foolish assumption. And things were even worse for the Outer Rim planets and systems, many of whom were placed on waiting lists to join the Republic for thousands of years and didn't have any representation at all. And so because there was no political representation in those Outer Rim territories, there was actually very little political incentive to actually spend money on developing the necessary infrastructure for growth in those areas, like stable hyperspace lanes, communications, maybe a few warships that could be placed out there to prevent pirates and raiders from killing everyone. These Outer Rim planets were also heavily dependent on the Republic's free market for export and import, and were highly susceptible to trade regulations and tariffs placed on the region. And so for most of galactic history, the Outer Rim enjoyed taxation without representation or even basic services. In truth, the cards were always stacked against the Outer Rim. Even though they had a lot of resources that they could exploit because they had no political power, they also had no economic power because the Republic was the one who regulated prices for a lot of commodities, created tariffs and regulations to make imports of goods from those Outer Rim areas a lot harder. And whatever resources the Outer Rim did have, they just didn't have the technology, capital, and manpower to extract them at large enough of a scale to be competitive. And so the Outer Rim was always reliant on corporate entities to step in and help, as was the case with the plasma production project on Naboo, headed by the Trade Federation. That technically was in the Mid-Rim, but again, that's bordering the Outer Rim anyway. And we all remember how that went, right? When the Free Trade Zone was created about a century before the Clone Wars began, the Outer Rim finally experienced an influx of capital and development thanks to the many corporate entities that took advantage of the tax-free areas. But instead of creating a lot of wealth for the locals, it just created wealth for these corporate entities, and a lot of terrible things happened as these corporate entities essentially established their own feudal states in the area. The Trade Federation controlled all trade and transport from the core to the Outer Rim and practiced price fixing and gouging. Companies like the Techno Union built massive factories and entrapped workers with low wages and high living costs. The IGBC would send its armies of IG bots to retrieve debts and enforce their will on small businesses and settlements that weren't willing to cooperate with the corporate expansion being planned almost everywhere in the Outer Rim. There was, however, a small decrease in pirate attacks and raiders because the Corpos also brought their own security forces along with them. And so every time a war was started in the galaxy, every time the Sith tried to take a shot at the Republic, the dark side Force users would capitalize on this tension between the core and the Outer Rim, between, I guess, stability in society versus ultimate freedom and kind of chaos. Whether it was the ancient Sith Empire or the Confederacy of Independent Systems, the Sith told the same tales to the masses in the Outer Rim they managed to convince to fight on their side. They spoke of the corruption, the bureaucracy, the arrogance of the people in the core, and they basically highlighted a lot of these real grievances the people in the Outer Rim had. And so war would always erupt. You also had criminal enterprises like the Hutt clans or the Zygerian slave empire, or warrior factions like the Mandalorians operating in the power vacuum created by the Republic's neglect of the Outer Rim. These factions would also become problems for the Republic. And so basically that was how the galaxy was really split up. It wasn't dark side and light side, it was Outer Rim versus the core. You had people in the core who believed in a strong and powerful federal government, and then you had people in the Outer Rim who were skeptical of the central government, but due to their own political weakness and lack of economic power, they found themselves being exploited constantly and used as pawns in other factions' wars against the Republic for most of Star Wars history. Some might say the Outer Rim was poor and dangerous because of the neglect of the Republic, and others might say that same neglect is what made the Outer Rim so beautiful and free, the perfect place for a pioneer to go settle in. It's definitely not surprising that when the Empire rose in place of the Republic, the core region of the galaxies mostly supported the ascension of Palpatine. Meanwhile, the Outer Rim became a potent place for the Rebel Alliance to recruit and position its fleets and garrisons. No matter which powers are in place in the galaxy, there will always be this split between the core regions and the frontier lands of the Outer Rim. The split between those who choose to live out in remote areas and those who choose to live in built-up urbanized areas is something that's always existed in human culture since the first days when the hunter and gatherer tribes split from the agrarian societies that decided to settle down. But still, at the end of the day, we are all quite similar. What's important, I think, is to treat each other with respect and try to understand how the other side lives. And as I travel more and more around this world, I'm beginning to notice that there are a lot of similarities from nation to nation based on what people do rather than what nation they live in. For instance, a farmer in Vietnam might have a lot of similarities with a farmer in the United States. Sure, the scale of what they're doing and the technology of what they're doing is very different, but at the end of the day, you're still working the land and you still have that similar appreciation for what you're doing. And the same could be said for city dwellers. In almost any country in the world, you have these large globalized cities where people basically watch the same content, they understand the same humor, they understand the same struggles of their daily lives as they're waiting in traffic or waiting in the metro. I think it's a really interesting phenomenon in human development. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.